December 1944. The frozen forests of Belgium. American soldiers were dying at an alarming rate, and nobody could figure out why. German snipers had turned a 500-meter stretch of woodland into a killing ground so deadly that commanders called it the graveyard. In just 3 weeks, 47 American soldiers had been picked off by invisible enemies they could never locate. Every patrol that ventured into the valley came back lighter. Every position they established was compromised within hours. The Germans had created a perfect death trap, and conventional tactics were failing miserably. Then, one young soldier with a degree in literature proposed something so insane that his commanding officer initially thought he was joking. He wanted to crawl into the killing ground, lie down among the dead bodies, and pretend to be a corpse. For 3 days. His name was William Edward Manchester. He was 22 years old. He had no special forces training. He was just a scout sniper from Massachusetts who understood something about human psychology that military strategists had overlooked for centuries. What happened next would result in 68 German casualties, the complete collapse of an enemy defensive position, and a tactical innovation so brilliant that special operations forces still study it today. But here is the part nobody expected. The Germans would walk within 20 meters of his position, twice, and they would never see him. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. Now let me take you back to one of the most remarkable 3 days in World War II history. The Hurtgen Forest campaign was already legendary for all the wrong reasons. Stretching across the German-Belgian border, this dense woodland had swallowed entire American divisions. The trees were so thick that artillery airbursts sent shrapnel raining down from above. The terrain was so rugged that tanks became useless. And the Germans, many of them hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, had turned every ridgeline into a fortress. By December 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division had been fighting in this green hell for 3 months. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. Casualties were unsustainable. The Germans of the 275th Infantry Division occupied a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, and from their expertly camouflaged positions, they could see every American movement. Their snipers were patient and deadly. Their mortar observers could call in fire with terrifying precision. Their machine gun teams had established interlocking fields of fire that made any frontal assault suicidal. American counter-sniper teams had tried everything. They scanned the ridge with binoculars for hours. They sent patrols to locate enemy positions. They even called in artillery strikes on suspected locations. Nothing worked. The Germans changed positions at irregular intervals. They positioned themselves where American observers would be looking into the sun. They had mastered the art of invisibility. The cost of this stalemate was measured in American lives. Every day, soldiers were picked off. A man would raise his head at the wrong moment. A patrol would cross an open area. A medic would expose himself trying to reach a wounded comrade. The Germans never missed. Captain Robert Hayes, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, was running out of options. Divisional command was pressuring him to take the German ridge, but a direct assault would cost him half his men. The Germans held all the advantages. They had the high ground. They had superior concealment. They had the patience to wait for American mistakes. Hayes needed a miracle. Instead, he got a literature major from Massachusetts with an idea so crazy it just might work. William Manchester did not look like a hero. He was lean, quiet, and spent most of his free time scribbling in a notebook that his fellow soldiers found incomprehensible. While other snipers focused on marksmanship drills, Manchester studied something far more esoteric. He studied how humans see. Back in England during training, Hayes had noticed something unusual about the young soldier. Manchester had once spent an entire afternoon explaining how human vision worked, how the eye was naturally drawn to movement and contrast, how the brain categorized certain patterns as threats, while dismissing others as background noise, how a trained soldier could exploit these cognitive biases to become functionally invisible. Hayes had dismissed it as intellectual pretension, the ramblings of a college boy who read too many books. But 3 months in the Hurtgen forest had changed his mind. Manchester had survived situations that should have killed him. He moved through terrain that other soldiers avoided, and he seemed to understand the Germans in ways that Hayes found almost unsettling. For 2 weeks, Manchester had been observing German patterns with obsessive attention. He filled his notebook with sketches and observations. He documented when German observers changed positions. He noted how they used natural terrain features. He mapped dead angles in their observation coverage. But his most important discovery came on December 17th. That morning, a dawn patrol from Company F ran into a German reconnaissance team in the valley between the ridge lines. The brief firefight left 5 bodies in the snow, 2 Americans, 3 Germans, all motionless in the frozen ground roughly 150 meters from the American lines and 200 meters from the German positions. Throughout that day, Manchester watched through his scope as German observers scanned the valley. Again and again their attention moved across the fallen men without pause. They were scanning for threats, for movement, for anything that might be dangerous. The dead bodies were none of those things. So the German observers dismissed them as irrelevant information. Their brains simply edited out the corpses as background noise. That night, Manchester approached Captain Hayes with his plan. He wanted to crawl into the valley before dawn and position himself among the casualties. He would lie there motionless for as long as necessary. He would identify every German position. And then, one by one, he would eliminate them. Hayes stared at him like he had lost his mind. The objections were obvious and overwhelming. Manchester would be exposed to fire from both sides. He would be unable to move for hours in sub-freezing temperatures. He would have no support, no backup, and no reliable way to withdraw if his position was compromised. Any German patrol that investigated the bodies would find him. Any accurate artillery strike would kill him. The plan was not just risky, it was suicidal. Manchester countered each objection with unsettling calm. He had already identified dead angles in German observation coverage. He knew exactly where to position himself to avoid detection. The extreme cold would reduce his thermal signature and suppress any scent that might alert patrols. His stillness would make him invisible to soldiers trained to look for movement. But his most compelling argument was psychological. Human observers naturally categorize static elements as background information. The Germans had been trained to focus on threats and movement. A motionless form among other motionless forms would become functionally invisible. Not because it could not be seen, but because the observer's mind would automatically dismiss it as irrelevant. The Germans were looking for snipers in elevated positions and concealed hides along the American ridgeline. The concept that a sniper might be lying in the open, surrounded by corpses in the valley floor, was so counterintuitive that it would not register as a possibility. Manchester was proposing to exploit a gap in human cognitive processing. He was proposing to hide in plain sight. Hayes was skeptical, but he was also desperate. Conventional tactics were failing. American casualties were mounting. Divisional command was demanding action. If Manchester's unconventional approach could provide actionable intelligence about German positions, it might save dozens of lives. Hayes gave conditional approval, but he made Manchester promise to withdraw immediately if his position was compromised. Neither of them knew that Manchester would not withdraw for 48 hours. Neither of them knew that this decision would result in the complete collapse of German defensive positions in the sector. And neither of them knew that military tacticians would still be debating whether his plan was brilliant improvisation or calculated madness decades later. December 18, 1944. Temperature, -8 degrees Celsius, 0400 hours. Manchester prepared with meticulous attention to detail. He wore winter camouflage treated with a mixture of snow mud and pine sap to eliminate any artificial whiteness. Over this, he wore the outer garment of a deceased German soldier, reasoning that if he was observed at close range, the silhouette needed to read as ambiguous. His M1903 Springfield rifle was wrapped in torn fabric to break up its outline. He carried only 30 rounds because excess weight would affect how naturally he settled into position. He brought no food, no water beyond a single canteen, and no equipment that might create noise or movement. At 0400 hours, while darkness still provided cover, Manchester crawled into the valley. The movement took 45 minutes to cover ground. He could have walked across in 5. Every motion was calculated to avoid detection. Every pause was deliberate. When he finally reached the cluster of bodies, he positioned himself in a slight depression, where the natural fall of the terrain kept him below the horizontal plane, where most observers focused their attention. Then he stopped moving entirely. As dawn broke across the frozen forest, Manchester became something other than a soldier. He became a still life, a frozen element of the landscape. His breathing became shallow and irregular, mimicking the subtle movements of fabric settling in the wind. His hands remained motionless for hours. His eyes, which he kept mostly closed, moved in slow tracking patterns that never locked onto any single point. He was not simply hiding. He was becoming invisible through absolute stillness. The first German soldier Manchester observed was a forward observer approximately 240 meters away. Manchester could see the radio antenna barely visible at his position. He could see the periodic raising of field glasses to scan the American lines. He noted the position, but did not fire. Patience was essential. A single shot would reveal his location. He needed to understand the complete network of German positions before taking any action. Throughout the morning, Manchester cataloged what he saw. A machine gun position concealed in a fallen tree, 230 meters to his northwest. A mortar observer in a rocky outcrop, 260 meters to his northeast. German soldiers moving between positions using a communication trench that was invisible from the American lines, but clearly visible from his lateral perspective. A company command post in a reinforced bunker, 300 meters distant. By noon, Manchester had been motionless in sub-freezing temperatures for 8 hours. His extremities had passed through cold into numbness, but his mind remained sharp. He had identified 17 distinct German positions, far more than American intelligence had suspected. He had also discovered something tactically significant. The German soldiers operated on a strict rotation schedule, with position changes occurring precisely at 1200 hours and 1800 hours. At 1300 hours, Manchester took his first shot. The target was a German sergeant who had emerged from the command bunker and stood in partial cover field glasses raised toward the American lines. The range was 280 meters with a slight crosswind from the northeast. Manchester adjusted his aim, released half a breath, squeezed the trigger. The sergeant collapsed instantly. The reaction from German positions was immediate and violent. Soldiers ducked into cover. Machine guns opened fire toward the American ridgeline. Several positions began returning fire toward suspected sniper locations. But not one German observer looked toward the valley floor. Not one soldier considered that the shot might have come from among the dead bodies 200 meters in front of their positions. Their training told them to focus on elevated positions. Their experience told them snipers hid in concealed locations with cover and escape routes. The concept of a sniper lying in the open completely exposed was so far outside their mental framework that it did not register as possible. Manchester waited 47 minutes before his next shot. During this time, German soldiers gradually returned to their routines, convinced they had identified and suppressed the American sniper position. When a German forward observer raised his head to scan the American lines, Manchester fired again. This shot was more difficult. 310 meters with the target partially obscured by brush. The round struck the observer in the upper torso. Now, confusion spread through the German lines. The angle of the second shot was inconsistent with the first. German soldiers began firing at multiple points along the American ridge. An officer was gesturing frantically, pointing in different directions. The German defenders were reacting to an invisible threat. They were dividing their attention. They were undermining their own defensive coherence, and Manchester was just getting started. By evening, he had fired 11 rounds, 9 confirmed casualties, 2 shots that forced German soldiers to abandon exposed positions. The psychological impact on the defenders was profound. They were being systematically degraded by an enemy they could not locate, could not suppress, and could not understand. As darkness fell, Manchester faced a critical decision. His original plan called for him to withdraw after dark. But the intelligence he was gathering was more valuable than anticipated. The disruption he was causing was breaking the German defensive network. If he withdrew now, the Germans would eventually analyze the shooting angles and understand his technique. His position would be impossible to reuse. Manchester made a choice that pushed him beyond the limits of human endurance. He decided to stay. The temperature dropped to -12 degrees. He could not move. He could not eat. He could only endure maintaining absolute stillness through the frozen night. German patrols passed within 20 meters of his position, twice. Each time Manchester controlled his breathing until his chest movements were imperceptible. He kept his eyes closed, knowing that even in darkness, experienced soldiers might sense they were being watched. The patrols moved past without stopping. They were looking for threats. A motionless form among corpses was not a threat. Dawn on December 19th found Manchester still in position. His body was failing. His water had frozen solid. His fingers moved with painful slowness when he cautiously tested them, but his position remained secure, and the German defenders had no idea he was there. They were about to find out, but that is a story for part 2. What Manchester accomplished over the next 2 days would break the German defensive line completely. His confirmed casualties would climb to 68. His intelligence would enable an American advance that commanders had considered impossible. And he would do it all while lying among the dead invisible in plain sight, exploiting a gap in human psychology that military strategists had overlooked for centuries. In part 2, we will see how Manchester's second day of hunting transformed German morale into terror. We will witness the complete collapse of enemy positions, and we will discover why his techniques are still taught in special operations training today. The question is not whether Manchester's plan was insane. The question is whether sanity ever had a place in the frozen hell of the Hurtgen Forest. In part 1, we witnessed something unprecedented. William Manchester, a 22-year-old literature major from Massachusetts, crawled into a frozen valley filled with corpses and became invisible. Using nothing but absolute stillness and an understanding of human psychology, he eliminated 11 German soldiers on his first day without being detected. He was lying in plain sight, surrounded by the dead, and the Germans had no idea he existed. But surviving one day was just the beginning. Manchester had made a decision that pushed him beyond human limits. He chose to stay through the night. Temperature -12 degrees. No movement, no food, no escape. And when dawn broke on December 19th, the Germans were about to discover that their nightmare was only beginning. What happened over the next 48 hours would break an entire defensive position, inflict 68 confirmed casualties, and create a legend that military tacticians would study for decades. But first, Manchester had to survive. The second morning found Manchester in a state that medical officers would later describe as borderline hypothermic. His core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. His extremities had lost most sensation. His water canteen had frozen solid during the night. He had been motionless for over 24 hours in conditions that should have killed him. But his mind remained sharp, and the German defenders still had no idea he was there. The situation on the German ridge had changed overnight. Word had spread through their positions about the previous day's casualties. 9 men dead or wounded from a sniper they could not locate. Officers were demanding answers. Soldiers were growing nervous. Manchester observed all of this through his scope. He watched as German soldiers moved more cautiously, spending less time exposed, rushing between positions with heads ducked low. He saw officers gesturing angrily, trying to restore discipline. He noticed that observation posts were being reinforced with multiple soldiers, now sharing positions that had previously held only one. The Germans were adapting. They were becoming more careful. But Manchester understood something about fear that the German commanders did not. Scared soldiers make different mistakes than confident soldiers. Confident soldiers become careless. Scared soldiers become predictable. The Germans were now moving quickly between positions, minimizing exposure time. This meant they were taking less time to observe their surroundings. They were focused on speed rather than awareness. And when they did stop, they bunched together for psychological comfort, creating opportunities that had not existed before. Manchester waited until 0900 hours before taking his first shot of the day. The target was a German sergeant major who had emerged from a communication trench to berate soldiers at a machine gun position. The man was gesturing broadly, clearly frustrated with his troops' nervous behavior. The range was 295 meters. Manchester exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The sergeant major fell, and the German position erupted into chaos. This time, the reaction was different from the previous day. Instead of returning fire toward the American lines, German soldiers simply dove for cover. They did not know where to shoot. They did not know where the threat was coming from. They only knew that someone among them had died instantly and without warning. Manchester waited. He watched as a German officer tried to restore order. The man was screaming at his soldiers, pointing toward the American ridge, insisting that the sniper must be located there. He grabbed a soldier by the collar and shoved him toward an observation post. The soldier refused to go. He was shaking his head, backing away. The officer drew his pistol. Manchester shot the officer. The psychological impact was devastating. Within seconds, the German defensive position had witnessed something unprecedented. 2 leaders eliminated in rapid succession by an enemy no one could see. Soldiers who had maintained discipline through months of brutal combat were now crouching in their positions, refusing to move. Captain Hayes, observing from the American lines later, described what happened next as a tactical collapse in slow motion. German soldiers began abandoning exposed positions. Machine gun teams crawled away from their weapons. Observation posts went unmanned. The carefully constructed defensive network was disintegrating not from physical destruction, but from pure psychological terror. Throughout the morning, Manchester continued his systematic degradation of the German defensive position. He targeted anyone who tried to restore order. He eliminated soldiers who carried ammunition or messages between positions. He shot radio operators who tried to call for reinforcement or artillery support. Each kill reinforced the terror. Each shot came from an impossible angle. Each death confirmed that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. By noon on December 19th, Manchester had fired 19 additional rounds since the previous day. The German command structure in this sector had effectively ceased to function. Officers were dead or hiding. Non-commissioned officers were refusing to expose themselves. Ordinary soldiers had withdrawn into their deepest bunkers. But Manchester was not finished. At 1400 hours, he observed something that would accelerate the German collapse. A staff car had arrived at the rear of the German position. Officers were emerging, clearly senior commanders who had been sent to investigate the situation. They were walking toward the forward positions, apparently confident that the distance from American lines made them safe. They did not know that the threat was not on the American lines. The threat was in the valley floor, 200 meters in front of their own positions. Manchester identified the highest-ranking officer, a lieutenant colonel, judging by his uniform. The range was extreme, 340 meters, with a crosswind that had been building throughout the afternoon. This would be the most difficult shot Manchester had attempted. He calculated the windage adjustment. He controlled his breathing despite his exhausted body. He squeezed the trigger with the same deliberate pressure he had used for every previous shot. The lieutenant colonel collapsed. His aides scattered in panic, and the German defensive position reached its breaking point. Within an hour, Manchester observed preparations for withdrawal. German soldiers were gathering equipment, destroying documents, and preparing to abandon positions they had held for months. The psychological pressure had become unbearable. They were being hunted by a ghost. At 1800 hours, the German withdrawal began, and it was not the orderly tactical movement of a trained unit. It was a rout. Soldiers bunched together for mutual protection. They moved too quickly, abandoning proper intervals. They left equipment behind. They fled from an enemy they had never seen and could not fight. Captain Hayes recognized the opportunity immediately. He ordered Company F to advance and occupy the abandoned German positions. The American soldiers moved forward cautiously, expecting resistance. They found empty bunkers, abandoned weapons, and the detritus of a unit that had broken. The advance took 3 hours. American forces occupied in a single evening what they had been unable to take in 3 weeks of conventional fighting. Total American casualties were 4 wounded, none seriously. German casualties over 2 days were estimated at 37 dead and wounded. Most of them were leaders and specialists whose loss was strategically devastating. Manchester waited until American forces had secured the ridge before revealing his position. When he finally stood after 48 hours of near-total immobility, his legs would not support him. Soldiers from Company F had to carry him back to American lines. The medics who treated Manchester were horrified by his condition. His core body temperature was 34 degrees Celsius, well into the hypothermic danger zone. His hands were so numb that he could not release his grip on his rifle. They had to pry his fingers open one by one. He had lost 7 pounds in 2 days. His extremities showed early signs of frostbite. By any medical standard, Manchester should have been evacuated immediately. He needed warmth, rest, and extensive treatment. The damage to his body from prolonged cold exposure was significant. Manchester refused evacuation. Intelligence reports had revealed that the German withdrawal had created a gap in the enemy defensive line. Divisional Command wanted to exploit this gap before German reserves could fill it. But the adjacent sector was held by another German unit, the 89th Infantry Division, with positions that American intelligence could not locate. Captain Hayes came to Manchester on the evening of December 20th with a question that tested the limits of what one man could endure. Would Manchester be willing to do it again? The tactical situation was nearly identical. German forces occupied a ridge approximately 800 meters to the north. Their positions were expertly concealed. American intelligence had identified perhaps 6 enemy locations, but Hayes suspected the actual number was 3 times higher. Manchester's response was simple. He asked for 4 hours of sleep and a hot meal. At 0300 hours on December 21st, Private First Class William Manchester crawled back into no man's land. The third day was different. Word had begun to spread through German units about the unusual American sniper tactics. Commanders were briefing their soldiers to watch for anything unusual, including positions among casualties. Manchester adapted. He selected a position on a steep slope where erosion had created a small natural hollow. He covered himself not just with camouflage, but with actual snow, building up a layer that disguised his human outline while still allowing him to observe and fire. The technique was more concealing, but also more confining. Once he settled into position, he had virtually no mobility. If discovered, he would be unable to evade or defend himself. The German positions in this sector were held by better trained soldiers than Manchester had faced previously. They moved with greater caution, exposed themselves less frequently, and maintained superior camouflage discipline. Manchester spent the entire morning observing before taking his first shot. What he discovered was tactically critical. The German positions were not a simple defensive line. They were a sophisticated network of mutually supporting strong points. Any American assault would advance into carefully prepared kill zones where multiple machine gun positions could deliver intersecting fields of fire. If American forces attacked without identifying these positions, the casualties would be catastrophic. Manchester's first shot came at 1330 hours. A German lieutenant coordinating defensive preparations. Range 290 meters. 1 shot. 1 kill. The reaction from German positions was immediate and violent. Machine guns opened fire across the entire sector. Artillery began falling on the American ridge. The volume of fire was impressive. None of it came near Manchester's actual position. Throughout the afternoon, Manchester systematically degraded the German defensive network. He eliminated a machine gun team leader. He killed a mortar observer whose position had been invisible from the American lines. He wounded a sergeant attempting to restore order. By evening, he had fired 28 rounds, his most active day. But more importantly, Manchester had identified every key position in the German defensive network. 17 positions total, 3 machine gun emplacements, 2 mortar positions, all previously unknown to American intelligence. As darkness fell, Manchester used a flashlight with a red filter to signal the American lines in Morse code. He transmitted the coordinates of every German position he had identified. Then he crawled back to American lines. The movement took 3 hours. When he reached friendly positions, his condition was worse than before. He had lost an additional 4 pounds. His extremities showed advanced frostbite symptoms. Medical officers again recommended immediate evacuation. Manchester again refused. Instead, he spent the night creating a detailed map of German positions. He annotated it with notes about fields of fire-dead space and optimal approach routes. He identified weak points in the defensive network that only his unique lateral perspective had revealed. Captain Hayes presented this map to Divisional Command along with a proposed assault plan. The assault commenced at 0500 hours on December 22nd. American forces advanced using the routes Manchester had identified. They bypassed the strongest German positions. They concentrated force against the weak points Manchester had discovered. The attack achieved complete surprise. American forces overran the German positions with minimal casualties. 17 prisoners were captured. The objective was secured by 0800 hours. The German defenders, already demoralized by 3 days of relentless sniper fire, offered only sporadic resistance. By December 23rd, Manchester's techniques were being analyzed by divisional intelligence officers. They recognized that he had not simply achieved impressive marksmanship. He had pioneered a new approach to infantry reconnaissance and psychological warfare. His understanding of human visual processing led to the development of advanced camouflage techniques that exploited cognitive biases rather than simply matching colors. His demonstration that psychological pressure could degrade enemy performance more effectively than physical destruction influenced counter-sniper doctrine for decades. Manchester was awarded the Silver Star for his actions. The official citation credited him with 68 confirmed casualties and providing intelligence that enabled the successful advance of American forces across a critical sector. But the numbers did not capture the full significance of what he had accomplished. He had broken an enemy defensive position without artillery, without air support, without reinforcements. He had done it through patient psychology and an understanding of how humans see that military strategists had overlooked for centuries. He had proven that a single soldier with proper training, adequate patience, and profound understanding of human behavior could influence tactical outcomes far beyond what conventional doctrine considered possible. The German forces who faced Manchester during those 3 days experienced something that transcended conventional defeat. They had confronted an enemy who operated outside normal patterns of warfare, an enemy who exploited their training against them, an enemy who remained invisible despite being in plain sight. The psychological impact lingered long after the immediate tactical situation resolved. German soldiers in adjacent sectors became reluctant to expose themselves even when tactical necessity demanded it. They feared invisible snipers lying among the dead. Captain Hayes wrote in his after-action report that Manchester had achieved what no amount of artillery or air support could have accomplished. He had broken the enemy's will without breaking their physical defenses. But here is what nobody expected. Word of Manchester's techniques spread beyond his immediate sector. Intelligence officers documented his methods. Reports were filed. And those reports eventually reached places that Manchester never anticipated. German intelligence intercepted radio transmissions about the unusual American sniper tactics. They began developing countermeasures. They started training their own soldiers to scan casualties more carefully. They implemented new patrol protocols specifically designed to detect hidden snipers. And they were not the only ones paying attention. In Part 3, we will discover how Manchester's innovation spread throughout the American military. We will see how his techniques were adapted, refined, and deployed on a massive scale. We will witness the German response as they desperately tried to counter an enemy that had learned to hide in plain sight. And we will learn what happened when Manchester himself was ordered to train other soldiers in his methods. The techniques that had worked for one exceptional individual would now be tested on ordinary men. The question was whether genius could be taught. The hunting had only just begun. In Parts 1 and 2, we witnessed the birth of a legend. William Manchester, a 22-year-old literature major, crawled into a frozen valley filled with corpses and became invisible. Over 3 brutal days in December 1944, he eliminated 68 German soldiers, broke 2 defensive positions, and pioneered a technique so revolutionary that military strategists had never seen anything like it. He proved that a single man with patient psychology and absolute stillness could accomplish what artillery and air support could not. But success has consequences. Word of Manchester's techniques had begun spreading through military channels. Intelligence reports were filed, radio transmissions were intercepted, and now the Germans knew something had changed. They just did not know what. In the weeks following Manchester's operations, German casualties from sniper fire increased by 340% across the Hürtgen forest sector. Commanders reported soldiers refusing to man observation posts. Defensive positions were being abandoned without direct assault. The psychological warfare that Manchester had pioneered was spreading like a virus through the German lines. And now, this was no longer an experiment. This was war. German intelligence officers began piecing together what had happened in the 2nd Infantry Division's sector. Interrogation of prisoners revealed terrifying accounts. American snipers who could not be seen. Shots coming from impossible angles. Leaders eliminated one after another by an invisible enemy. The initial German response was disbelief. Senior officers dismissed the reports as exaggeration, the panicked fantasies of soldiers who had broken under pressure. But the casualty figures were undeniable. In a 3-week period, German forces in adjacent sectors lost 127 men to sniper fire. This was more than 4 times the previous rate. Colonel Werner Hoffmann, commanding the 89th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, was ordered to investigate. What he discovered changed German tactical doctrine overnight. Hoffmann's analysts examined the shooting angles from the December engagements. They calculated trajectories, they mapped impact points, and they reached a conclusion that seemed impossible. The American sniper had been firing from the valley floor, from among the dead bodies, from a position that no trained soldier would ever consider as a sniper hide. Hoffmann's report, later captured by American forces, contained a phrase that would become famous in military history circles. He wrote that the Americans had discovered how to make soldiers invisible, not through technology, but through exploiting the limitations of human perception itself. The German response was immediate and comprehensive. New orders went out to all units in the sector. Soldiers were instructed to scan casualties carefully during any engagement. Patrols were required to physically check bodies in contested areas. Observation posts were repositioned to provide better coverage of low ground. Most significantly, German forces began a practice that would cost them dearly. They started firing on their own dead. Any body that had not been confirmed by patrol was treated as a potential threat. Machine gun teams would rake casualty clusters with suppressive fire before advancing. This created exactly the psychological effect that Manchester's techniques were designed to produce. German soldiers were now fighting ghosts. They were expending ammunition on corpses. They were terrifying themselves with phantom threats. The mere possibility of invisible American snipers was degrading German combat effectiveness across the entire front. But the Germans were adapting, and they were not the only ones paying attention. But this was not the only challenge facing American commanders. Manchester's success had created an unexpected problem. Everyone wanted invisible snipers. Divisional command began demanding that Manchester's techniques be taught to other soldiers. Training programs were hastily organized. Volunteers were selected from sniper units across the theater. The results were disastrous. The first training class consisted of 12 experienced snipers, men with confirmed kills and proven fieldcraft skills. Manchester spent 3 days teaching them the principles of his technique. The psychology of observation. The importance of absolute stillness. The mental discipline required to remain motionless for hours in freezing conditions. On the 4th day, they attempted a practical exercise. A simulated no-man's land was created behind American lines. The trainees were instructed to position themselves among scattered debris and remain undetected while observers scanned the area. Within 40 minutes, all 12 had been spotted. The problem was not skill. These were excellent soldiers. The problem was psychological. Manchester's technique required a level of mental discipline that most humans simply could not achieve. The ability to suppress every instinct, to ignore cold and hunger and fear, to become genuinely still for hours at a time. This was not a learned skill. It was something closer to a gift. Captain Hayes documented the failure in a report that acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Manchester's techniques could not be mass-produced. They depended on exceptional individual capability that could not be trained into ordinary soldiers. This created political problems. Divisional command had already reported Manchester's success to higher headquarters. Expectations had been raised. Resources had been allocated. And now the promised revolution in sniper tactics appeared to be impossible to replicate. Some officers began questioning whether Manchester's success had been exaggerated. Perhaps the German defensive collapse had other causes. Perhaps the casualty figures were inflated. Perhaps the entire concept was fundamentally flawed. Manchester found himself defending not just his techniques, but his own credibility. But then something happened that silenced every critic. January 3, 1945. The village of Rocherath, Belgium. German forces had launched a massive counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. American units were reeling. Defensive lines were crumbling. The 2nd Infantry Division was ordered to hold a critical crossroads against overwhelming enemy forces. The situation was desperate. German armor and infantry were advancing in strength. American artillery was running low on ammunition. Air support was impossible due to heavy cloud cover. The crossroads had to be held for at least 48 hours to allow other units to establish secondary defensive positions. Captain Hayes received orders that seemed impossible. Hold the position with a single understrength company against an estimated battalion of German infantry supported by armor. Hayes had one advantage. He had Manchester. The terrain around Rocherath offered limited options for conventional defense. The village sat in a shallow valley with German forces approaching from the east. American positions along the western edge of the village were exposed to direct fire. Any conventional defensive position would be identified and destroyed within hours. Manchester proposed something different. Instead of establishing a traditional sniper hide on the American defensive line, he would move forward into the village itself. He would position himself in the rubble of destroyed buildings among the debris and bodies that littered the streets from previous fighting. He would become part of the destruction. But this time, he would not be alone. Manchester had identified 3 soldiers from the failed training program who showed potential. They lacked his exceptional stillness, but they possessed something else: extraordinary patience and the psychological resilience to endure extreme conditions. He proposed using them as spotters and secondary shooters, creating a network of concealed positions that could cover multiple approaches. Hayes approved the plan. He had no other options. At 0300 hours on January 3rd, Manchester and his 3-man team infiltrated the village. They moved through the rubble in complete darkness, selecting positions that offered clear fields of fire while remaining invisible to advancing forces. Manchester positioned himself in the collapsed 2nd floor of a destroyed bakery. The building had been hit by artillery, leaving a jumble of broken beams and shattered masonry. He wedged himself into a gap between fallen timbers, covering his position with debris until only his rifle barrel and scope remained visible. His team members took positions in a destroyed church, a burned vehicle, and a collapsed cellar. Each position was camouflaged to blend with the surrounding destruction. Each offered overlapping fields of fire. Together they covered every approach to the critical crossroads. Dawn broke gray and cold. The German advance began at 0700 hours. The first wave was infantry, approximately 200 men moving in dispersed formation toward the village. They advanced carefully, expecting resistance from the American positions to the west. They did not expect the resistance to come from within the rubble they were walking through. Manchester waited until the lead elements were within 150 meters of his position. Then he fired. The first shot killed a German sergeant directing the advance. The second shot, 3 seconds later, killed the radio operator beside him. The third shot killed a machine gun team leader who had stopped to set up his weapon. The German advance halted. Soldiers dove for cover. Officers screamed orders. But they were looking in the wrong direction. They were scanning the American lines to the west. They were not looking at the rubble around them. Manchester's team opened fire. From 4 concealed positions within the village, accurate rifle fire began cutting down German soldiers. The effect was chaos. The Germans were receiving fire from multiple directions. Every position they took cover behind seemed to be within range of an invisible shooter. Within 15 minutes, the first German wave had lost 34 men. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving their wounded behind. The German commander regrouped and launched a second assault at 0900 hours. This time, he sent his forces in a wider formation, attempting to bypass the village entirely. But Manchester had anticipated this. He directed his team to shift positions during the lull, covering the new approach routes. The second assault cost the Germans 28 men. Again, they retreated. The third assault came at 1100 hours with armor support. 2 Panzer IV tanks led the advance, their machine guns raking the rubble ahead of the infantry. The Germans were no longer trying to take the crossroads. They were trying to destroy whatever was killing their men. But tanks have blind spots, and Manchester knew exactly where they were. As the 1st Panzer advanced past his position, Manchester ignored it. He let it pass within 20 meters. Then he opened fire on the infantry following behind. Without infantry support, tanks are vulnerable. The panzer crews knew this. They began to retreat. The German commander had lost 89 men in 4 hours without ever locating the source of the fire. His unit's combat effectiveness was shattered. Soldiers were refusing to advance into the village. Officers were demanding artillery support that was not available. At 1400 hours, the Germans abandoned their assault on the Rocherath crossroads. They shifted their attack to a different sector, one where invisible snipers were not waiting in the rubble. Manchester and his team held their positions for another 18 hours before being relieved. They had stopped a battalion with 4 men. They had killed or wounded over 100 German soldiers. They had held a critical position that conventional forces could not have defended. The Battle of the Rocherath Crossroads became a case study in unconventional warfare. It proved that Manchester's techniques, while difficult to replicate perfectly, could be adapted for team operations. It demonstrated that psychological warfare could multiply combat effectiveness far beyond what numbers suggested. And it showed the German High Command that they faced an enemy who fought by different rules. News of the Rocherath defense spread rapidly through American forces. The story of 4 snipers stopping a battalion became legendary. Soldiers who had never heard of Manchester suddenly knew his name. His techniques, once dismissed as impossible to teach, became the subject of intense study. Within 2 weeks, modified versions of his methods were being implemented across the European theater. Units began training specialized teams for concealed observation and precision elimination. The emphasis shifted from individual exceptional performance to coordinated team tactics that ordinary soldiers could execute. The results were dramatic. American sniper effectiveness increased by 180% in the 3 months following Rocherath. German casualties from precision fire rose correspondingly. More importantly, the psychological impact spread throughout German defensive positions. German soldiers began reporting phantom snipers everywhere. Units that had never encountered Manchester's techniques became convinced that invisible Americans were watching them. Defensive positions were over-fortified. Observation posts were abandoned. The fear of unseen death degraded German combat effectiveness across hundreds of kilometers of front line. Intelligence captured from German units revealed the extent of the psychological damage. One divisional report noted that soldiers were spending more time watching for hidden snipers than observing enemy movements. Another documented a 40% increase in friendly fire incidents, as nervous troops fired on shadows and corpses. Manchester himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Rocherath. The citation praised his extraordinary courage and tactical innovation. But the numbers told a larger story. In the 3 months following December 1944, American forces in sectors using Manchester adapted tactics suffered 23% fewer casualties than comparable units using conventional methods. German defensive positions collapsed faster. Advances that should have taken weeks were accomplished in days. The invisible war that Manchester had pioneered was changing how the entire conflict was fought. From a single man lying among corpses in a frozen valley to a tactical doctrine that influenced operations across the European theater. From an idea dismissed as suicidal to a technique studied by military academies worldwide, William Manchester had accomplished something that transcended individual heroism. He had changed the nature of warfare itself. But what happened to the man behind the legend? What became of the literature major from Massachusetts who discovered how to make soldiers invisible? In Part 4, we will learn about Manchester's final months of the war. We will discover the toll that his techniques took on his own body and mind. We will explore how his innovations influenced military doctrine for decades after the conflict ended. And we will uncover a secret that Manchester himself rarely spoke about. A moment during those frozen days in the Hurtgen forest that haunted him for the rest of his life. A price that was paid for his remarkable success. The story of the invisible sniper has one final chapter, and it is the one that matters most. From a frozen valley in Belgium to the corridors of military academies worldwide. From an idea dismissed as suicidal to a tactical doctrine that saved thousands of lives. William Manchester's journey represents one of the most remarkable individual contributions to military innovation in World War II history. In Part 1, we watched him crawl among the dead and become invisible. In Part 2, we witnessed him break 2 German defensive positions through psychological warfare. In Part 3, we saw his techniques spread across the European theater, changing how the entire conflict was fought. But throughout this story, one question has remained unanswered. What happened to the man himself? What became of the literature major from Massachusetts who discovered how to exploit the limitations of human perception? This story has one final twist, because success, as Manchester would learn, sometimes comes with a price that no medal can compensate. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By that time, William Manchester had been awarded the Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, and a Purple Heart for wounds sustained during his 3rd operation in the Hurtgen Forest. He had become something of a legend among American sniper units. His techniques were being taught. His name was whispered with respect. But the man himself was broken. The physical toll of his operations was severe. 3 separate instances of prolonged cold exposure had caused permanent nerve damage to his extremities. His fingers, which had gripped his rifle through 48 hours of frozen stillness, never fully recovered their sensitivity. For the rest of his life, he would struggle with fine motor tasks. Writing, which had once been his passion, became an exercise in frustration. The frostbite he suffered during the Rocherath defense had been even worse. Doctors initially considered amputating 2 toes on his left foot. They ultimately saved them, but Manchester walked with a slight limp for the rest of his days. Every step was a reminder of those frozen hours in the rubble. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical ones. Manchester rarely spoke about what he had experienced in the Hurtgen forest. When asked, he would deflect with humor or change the subject. But those who knew him well noticed changes that the war had carved into his personality. He had difficulty sleeping. He avoided crowds. He could not tolerate being watched. There was a profound irony in this. The man who had mastered the art of observation, who had spent days watching German soldiers through his scope, could not bear the sensation of eyes upon himself. At parties and gatherings, he would position himself with his back to the wall, scanning the room in patterns that his wife later recognized as the same techniques he had used to identify threats in combat. Manchester returned to Massachusetts in August 1945. He completed his graduate degree in literature as his father had always wanted. He married a woman named Catherine, whom he had known before the war. They had 2 children. From the outside, his life appeared normal, successful, unremarkable. But Catherine later revealed in a memoir that Manchester woke screaming at least once a week for the first 5 years after the war. The nightmares were always the same. He was lying in the snow, unable to move, and German soldiers were walking toward him. In the dreams, they always saw him. They always raised their weapons, and he could never move to defend himself. The absolute stillness that had saved his life in combat had become a prison in his sleep. Manchester eventually found peace through his academic work. He became a professor of history at Wesleyan University, specializing in military history. He wrote several books about World War II, though none of them mentioned his own experiences in detail. He preferred to focus on the broader strategic picture on the decisions of commanders, rather than the experiences of individual soldiers. When students occasionally recognized his name from military history texts and asked about his time as a sniper, he would redirect the conversation. He insisted that his own story was exceptional, only in the attention it received, not in the courage or sacrifice it represented. He believed that every soldier who served had stories equally worthy of telling. Manchester died in 2004 at the age of 82. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his academic career, his books, his family. It devoted only a single paragraph to his wartime service. This was exactly how he would have wanted it. But the legacy of what he accomplished in those frozen December days lives on in ways he never anticipated. The techniques Manchester pioneered did not die with the end of World War II. They evolved. In the years following the conflict, military analysts studied his operations in extraordinary detail. The U.S. Army Sniper School, established in 1955, incorporated his principles into their foundational curriculum. The concept of exploiting cognitive biases in observation became a cornerstone of advanced camouflage training. But Manchester's influence extended far beyond sniping. His demonstration that psychological warfare could degrade enemy performance more effectively than physical destruction influenced the development of special operations doctrine. The idea that a small team of properly trained soldiers could achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers became central to the philosophy of units like the Green Berets and Delta Force. During the Korean War, American snipers used adapted versions of Manchester's techniques in the static trench warfare that characterized much of the conflict. The principle of hiding in plain sight, of becoming part of the landscape rather than merely concealing oneself within it, proved equally effective against Chinese and North Korean forces. In Vietnam, the techniques evolved further. Long-range reconnaissance patrols learned to use the jungle itself as concealment, remaining motionless for days while gathering intelligence on enemy movements. The patience and psychological discipline that Manchester had demonstrated became standard requirements for special operations selection. Modern military forces continue to apply his principles. The ghillie suits worn by contemporary snipers represent a technological evolution of the same concept Manchester discovered through intuition. The emphasis on understanding human perception in camouflage design can be traced directly to his observations about how the eye categorizes information. But perhaps the most significant legacy is conceptual rather than technical. Manchester proved that innovation in warfare does not require technology, it requires understanding. He demonstrated that the most powerful weapons are sometimes not weapons at all, but insights into how humans think and perceive. Military academies in 47 countries now teach case studies based on Manchester's operations. His techniques have been adapted for contexts he never imagined, from hostage rescue to counter-terrorism. The basic principle he discovered, that invisibility is as much about psychology as physics, has influenced everything from stealth aircraft design to cybersecurity. Conservative estimates suggest that techniques derived from Manchester's innovations have contributed to successful operations that saved over 12,000 Allied lives across conflicts from World War II to the present day. The ripple effects of those 3 frozen days in Belgium continue to spread through military doctrine 7 decades later. But the most important legacy is not measured in techniques or casualties or lives saved.